how's that for my first few notes of today's lesson? Not very enticing. I have to give a disclaimer. Using an active embouchure means that these muscles being engaged for a long time, that is definitely more difficult than a passive embouchure. We don't need manipulation from movement or from lip changes in order to play. We can just keep everything still and the same. Let's talk about the playing mechanism. It's a pretty broad term. It encompasses a lot of things. We're going to talk about things that have to do with our aperture, the hole where the air comes out. We're going to talk about things that have to do with the embouchure, which is everything else. We're going to talk about how all of that mixes together with your use of the air. And finally, how does that all come together on the trumpet? How does that interact together? The first step to working on your playing mechanism is to be aware. Know yourself. We need consistency. In order to do that, it's really important to be aware of the actions that you're taking, the responses that you're having, and how all of these pieces work together. I'm very passionate about this, and this may be more detailed than you've heard it in the past. Maybe not, but I hope that this information can be enlightening in some way. Let's start by talking about the embouchure. Now, if I say embouchure, that can draw a lot of pictures in your brain on that may be different. We could be thinking about embouchure as in everything in the face. We could maybe be thinking just of right here. Who knows? Maybe we're just thinking about the very center, which is where your aperture is. I like to consider embouchure as all encompassing because I think that everything in your face, all of the muscles there, whether that is everything back to your deep cheek muscles back here, through the round circular kind of donut muscle that goes all the way around your lips, through those kind of pivot points at the corner, all the way to your lips themselves. I feel like that is all working uh, harmoniously together. Maybe they're not doing the exact same thing all the time, but they're all involved in the process. So when I think about embouchure, I'm making sure that I'm aware of everything that's going on here, not just here. Within the embouchure, there is the aperture, the spot where the air goes through, that tiny dark circle right in the center of your lips, where there is no lip, where there's space for air to come through. That's the aperture. I like to think of your aperture similarly to an iris of a camera or like the middle of a drawstring bag, where you've got all of this muscle and tissue and things around it that influence eventually what's happening on this tiny, tiny hole in the center. When we go into further detail about the embouchure, what it's supposed to look like, where it's supposed to be positioned, where does your mouthpiece and your horn interact with all that, there are many, many opinions about how that should be done. It's probably one of the most explored and talked about parts of trumpet playing that there is because it's so important. The way that all of that comes together forms your sound. It forms the basis of all of your technique, and so much of the trumpet playing that you will ever do is reliant on how this process is formed. So naturally, people talk about it. There are many opinions, many people that put their stake in the sand and say, this is the way. And so I will forewarn you as we talk about this, take everything with a grain of salt. If it's useful, use it. And I encourage you to keep an open mind and try things as much as you can. It may work, it may not work. For me, a lot of the techniques I've learned didn't work properly in the beginning, and I had to learn at a much deeper level how to do them correctly before they brought me success. I will say that as a player, I've gone through an embouchure change. I've been in a place where I used plenty of bad habits and really needed to start over. Through that process, I had to do a lot of learning. I had to ask myself a lot of questions, and I had to be very humble and assume that I knew nothing to be completely true. Through that process, I took in a lot of information and distilled what works best for me. That might be slightly different for every one of you, but the most important part was staying open and ready to take in new ideas. After watching trumpet players from all walks of life play their trumpets and talking to them about technique, about what they're thinking about, maybe what they're not thinking about, I've noticed a lot of similarities. A lot of the best players out there seem to have the same fundamental concepts of how they play, regardless of how they choose to explain it. I've heard a great example of one of my absolute trumpet idols saying the way that you need to be thinking about forming an embouchure is about focus and keeping things together and keeping things um, really pointed with your embouchure and your aperture. And somebody, on the other hand, another one of my absolute favorite trumpet players of all time, says the complete opposite in that all they can think about when they play is trying to stay open. And while those sounded like two very different ideas at the time, after watching how both of these people played and a lot of the other professionals in that world, in that zone, I realized that they were actually trying to get at the same type of technique. They just had different ways of explaining it because they were two different people that had two different bodies, two different setups, um, two different face shapes. They had different ways of explaining their way into what was essentially the same technique all along. I'm going to try and describe that technique to you today in the best way that I know how. You may need some adjustment on your end, but take things with a grain of salt and know that the way I came to these conclusions was through a lot of trial and error too. When talking about embouchure and the way that you integrate it into the horn, I find that there are two main ways that this happens, two options, if you will. One of them is by using a passive embouchure. That's where we form our lips and our face and our cheeks and corners and everything into a specific shape. Then we add the trumpet to it and let everything else just be passive. We just sort of push the trumpet on and hold on for the best. This way of playing, I think, is probably the easiest for young people to learn. It's a way that comes very naturally to most people. However, I think there are some severe drawbacks to this type of an embouchure. The way that I would suggest is by using an active embouchure. That kind of an embouchure is one that stays engaged all of the time. It's never passive. It's never a in a position where you rely on pressure from the trumpet or other manipulation to make your playing happen. Instead, you are always engaged here and always making sure that your embouchure, your lips, your aperture, all of that is working together to maintain itself instead of letting other things manipulate it. Let me show you an example. If I'm using a passive embouchure, which I'll be frank, I used to use when I was growing up, I'll make my embouchure shape, I'll put my horn on, and then to maintain it and keep everything together, I'll just press a little bit of pressure and I'll play. This is what that sounds like. Now, how's that for my first few notes of today's lesson? Not very enticing. It didn't feel very good to play either. I felt a lot of pressure here. My lips didn't feel very healthy. I felt like I was pinched, and my air felt like it was very backed up and I couldn't use it very well. An active embouchure, again, involves engaging all of our face, all of our muscles, all of our embouchure in a way where we don't need pressure from the horn. We don't need manipulation from movement or from lip changes in order to play. We can just keep everything still and the same. This is what that sounds like instead. It results in a much more colorful sound all the way through the register. It also felt much more comfortable for me. It allowed me to breathe freely. It allowed my lips to stay with a healthy feeling and not feel like they were getting punched in the face. And I feel like I could have done that all day long. I have to give a disclaimer. Using an active embouchure means that these muscles being engaged for a long time, that is definitely more difficult than a passive embouchure. However, if you're thinking about adjusting the way that you play or maybe wanting to experiment with using an active embouchure, I can tell you the good news is that if you practice in small chunks, short chunks, maybe to where you're feeling a little tired and then stopping and then waiting a little while and coming back, those muscles and the ability to engage these muscles all the time gets much easier. Over the course of maybe a few weeks, even of just really dedicating yourself to great technique and short bursts of practice, that level of engagement can start to become second nature. And all of a sudden, it doesn't feel that hard to do anymore. Once you reach that point where you can create an embouchure that's free of involvement from anything else, you don't need any sort of crutch to keep your face together, the sky's the limit. Whether that is your endurance, whether that's your ability to play in the upper register, whether that's how loud or soft you can play, all of those things become much closer to you and easier when you play with an active embouchure. Now, when I mentioned endurance, endurance is something of a buzzword that we talk about in trumpet because in a lot of our minds, endurance means how long can I hold on? I like to think of endurance and especially working on endurance in a much different way. I think of endurance being the exact same word as efficiency. Luckily, both of those words start with E, so I'm in good luck today. Efficiency and endurance to me seem like the same thing because as a trumpet player, if I'm using bad habits and really working very hard to try and make my trumpet playing happen, it's exhausting and it can really tucker you out. And you can go from great playing to something you wouldn't want to listen to in a very short period of time. But if I spend some of my practice time and my energy focusing on my efficiency, making my process a little easier so I don't have to work so hard, I don't have to force, I don't have to overcome bad habits that I might have already been using, all of a sudden, I can play for so much longer. I can play different ranges of the instrument that I've never had access to before. And I can use different volumes at whatever I need to make the music happen. And it feels so much easier. It feels like I could go on forever. It doesn't feel like there's a point in the day where I just can't do it anymore. So when you think about endurance next time, maybe change that language in your head to efficiency. I feel like an hour of work on your efficiency will make you 10 times better than an hour of endurance practice. Now, a question that I've heard a lot and that I had to ask myself a lot was how do you practice doing active engagement, having an active embouchure? It's a very good question. And there's a few ways that you can do it. One of the easiest ways to start is by using free buzzing. Now, I know you may have done some buzzing on a mouthpiece where we make buzzing sounds using this, but I don't even want to use that. I want to have absolutely no assistance and practice creating vibration without the use of either of these, without the horn, without the mouthpiece. If free buzzing is something that you've never tried before, I do encourage you to give it a chance. If it sounds completely unintelligible at the beginning, I was right there with you when I did my first free buzzing. I never in a million years thought I would be a decent free buzzer. But practice and diligent effort and making distinctions made it come to me actually fairly quickly, a lot quicker than I thought it would. For free buzzing, for me, I like to do it as part of the first playing notes of my day. I'll start on a low C, keep things nice and simple, and I try and get a focused, pure sound. Go ahead and try that if you can. Try to do one of those just free buzzing on a low C. If you're able to get a sound like I'm making, fantastic. That's awesome. If it's a little bit unstable, well, that means that you've got some consistency things to work on. If you're nowhere near being able to make that sound, it's okay. In order to be able to free buzz, there's a lot of things that need to happen correctly. We've got to be able to keep our aperture the same size, even when we start to blow air through it and not let it expand. We've got to keep all of that in the same place using our lip muscles here. And we have to anchor all of that somewhere to keep it firm for a long period of time. That's where we use all the muscles here in our cheeks and our chin and I like to call it my mustache muscle. Using all of those things can be a little bit complicated and take some time to hone in on. However, when you put the time into it to get there, that free buzz becomes a really helpful tool in developing independence with your buzz from the horn.